This is a podcast by the Straits Times.
Welcome to Asian Insider, a podcast series by the Straits Times. I'm your host, Nirmal Ghosh. The direction and implications of the civil war in Myanmar remain hugely uncertain. This is concerning, of course, to two of Myanmar's giant neighbours, China and India, who themselves are not on the best of terms. India is concerned over growing Chinese influence on its eastern flank. But New Delhi also has to contend with unrest in parts of its own northeast. Now, to unravel a really complex situation, I have with me today Dr. Avinash Paliwal from the School of Oriental and African Studies, SOAS, at the University of London, and Dr. Aparna Pandey, Research Fellow at the Hudson Institute in Washington, D.C. Dr. Paliwal has a book just out, India's Near East, a new history of India's faltering attempts to exert control over its eastern hinterland and the neighboring states of Bangladesh and Myanmar. That's quoting from the blur. Dr. Pandey is, of course, a scholar of the geopolitics of South Asia and has written books on India's foreign policy. Aparna, welcome back to Asian Insider. Nice to have you on again. And Avinash, big congratulations on the book and welcome to Asian Insider. Thank you for doing this. So let me start with you, Avinash, and Aparna, please feel free to jump in anytime as usual. Avinash, what is India's perception and strategy vis-a-vis what is going on in Myanmar, where anti-regime armies are gaining ground?
Nirmal, first of all, thank you so much for having me on Asian Insider. I've followed your work very, very closely over the years, so this is a huge honor. In terms of India's perception and strategy towards Myanmar, which is a very complicated war, a war which is considered to be forgotten mostly by Myanmar's neighbors and the world alike, with other wars going on in the Middle East and between Russia and Ukraine. India's perception is very clear, and the situation is deeply concerning. It has been since the outbreak of war, starting February 1, 2021, when the coup occurred by the Myanmar junta, that this is a multi-sided civil war, and it is a long war. This is not a war that is likely to come to an end using diplomatic strategies, using conflict resolution techniques, or building some sort of a consensus within the various domestic stakeholders in Myanmar, but also in the region. None of that prospect seems likely. So this is a very concerning war, and it has deep implications for India's national security and well-being. The first and foremost is a concern of conflict spillover. Now, we are aware that in 2023, the far eastern state of Manipur, which borders Myanmar, has witnessed ethnic unrest between the Meitei and the Kuki communities. Of course, there are criminal elements and armed actors involved. And we know that the unrest that we have seen in Myanmar has some connection, if not a causal connection, but has some connection in terms of contributing or worsening the situation on the ground in Manipur. So this is something which is the security concerns which comes along with such conflict spillover is really at this point in time at the top of India's security agenda in its Near East. The second concomitant concern is a dislocation in India's broader Act East strategies, which has a very powerful connectivity, economic and infrastructural connectivity element to it. Over the past decade and a half, let's say from 2009, 2010 onwards, India has invested heavily in building road connectivity through Myanmar, building port connectivity in Rakhine State, and aiming for a trilateral highway which would connect people between Thailand, wider Southeast Asia, Myanmar, and India. None of these projects have really taken off in the kind of way that India envisioned it. Now, these ideas of connectivity are certainly not new, but the challenges that we are facing are of a different, novel caliber. And that is something which, again, it's frustrating New Delhi's efforts moving forward. And last but not least, the implication is, what does this mean in terms of the sense of anxiety India feels with China's influence in Myanmar? Now, clearly, China's own connectivity and strategic ambitions have been stymied by the civil war in Myanmar, and that is something which is not lost on Beijing, which has been doing considerable degree of heavy lifting, even if to limited effect, in building some sort of ceasefires within different armed forces, different ethnic armed groups and the junta in Myanmar. But still, it is the only regional power which has equities across the board on Myanmar's civil canvas. and Myanmar's kind of military canvas. And this is something which concerns India. This is a third concern. Now, in terms of India's strategy of dealing with the situation, I broadly see this as a defensive strategy. Myanmar is not a country in which India has historically enjoyed excess capabilities, whether it's diplomatic, whether it's material, whether it's political. And when you adopt a defensive strategy, it effectively means a degree of political conservatism wherein you invest and continue to invest in the junta, in Naypyidaw, despite knowing that the coup in 2021 caused the current crisis. India has open channels with Naypyidaw. India has open investments with Naypyidaw. And it is very clear to India that ideally it would like to see a restoration of electoral politics, if not liberal democracy in Myanmar. But short of that, it must not cut the channels that it has built with the junta. The other incrementally visible element of India's strategy, defensive strategy, is tactical outreach, often covert in nature, but increasingly also more comfortable in spelling it out to the world with the different ethnic armed organizations in Myanmar, as well as the national unity government, which is leading the resistance in a political sense, right? We do know that NUG has representatives sitting in New Delhi trying to coordinate this relationship. But we also know that India has, over the past many decades, maintained some degree of relationship with ethnic armed organizations, which are especially active in the border regions bordering northeast, whether it's the Chin National Front, the Arakan Army, the Kachin Independence Organization, and such like. The last point on that, Nirmal, and then I'll stop, of the defensive strategy, increasingly we have seen, is India's cancellation of what it called the free movement regime between Myanmar and India. It's a significant move. India invested hugely in building that kind of cross-border connectivity. It was not only important in a wider strategic sense for India's Act East policy, but also for the communities which have kinship networks across the border, which straddle across the borderland, whether it's Meitei, Kukis, Nagas, anyone, to actually be able to engage in cultural and economic sort of interactions across the border, right? And that has been called off. That's a significant move because it limits India's ability to play a leading role in influencing the politics on the ground in Myanmar with an eye to reconciliation at a future point in time. And it also limits the economic well-being or economic profits or productivity that accrues to that kind of cross-border connect. And that's a big part of this defensive strategy. It has invariably generated pushback on the ground. The state of Mizoram, the Mizo communities, the Naga communities in Nagaland or in North Manipur are unhappy with the cancellation of the free movement regime, the FMR. And that is a story that is yet to play out.
Okay. That was, I think, very good points over there, including the fact that India has limited influence to influence anything in Myanmar, actually, which oddly actually mirrors ASEAN's position. ASEAN also has extremely limited influence, and China just basically hopes for stability sooner rather than later. Now, Aparna, I wonder if you could add to that. How does India see this situation strategically? Or shall I put it another way? What are India's priorities? And do you expect any change, any creativity perhaps, or proactive role perhaps in Prime Minister Narendra Modi's third term, which has just begun?
Thanks, Nirmal. Great to be back on Asian Insider and wonderful to be on the panel with Avinash. Avinash has laid out all the key points, so in some ways there's little for me to add, but I'll just take maybe a 20,000 or 30,000 feet overview of the relations. India's dilemma remains at some level the things Avinash said, which is how do you balance relations with a neighbor who is key to India's internal security in a region which has historically had a number of insurgencies. It is important, whether it's vis-a-vis East Pakistan, Bangladesh now, or China. Second, a region which India seeks to develop, but hasn't really been able to provide the economic and developmental aspirations of the region. Third, it is India's continental gateway to Southeast Asia, both for economic and developmental reasons, but also to counter China as China deepens its presence into India's neighborhood. And finally, how do you balance the relationship with the historical support for democracy that India has given to Aung San Suu Kyi and the democracy movement with a 3-decade-old realpolitik relationship with the junta? And none of these has India found a good way. In some ways, India's relations with all its neighbors suffer from elements of sins of commission and omission. And Myanmar falls into one of those neighbors where India has never really been able to find the exact policy. Part of it has to do with that country's internal dynamics, over which India has no control. Part of it has to do with India's limited abilities itself. India doesn't have the massive amounts of cash to give any neighbor. It also does not, while it does have a military relationship with the junta, there's a limit to what India will provide the junta vis-a-vis what China will and other countries will. So, will there be a change in the current government? I do not think so. I think India will continue to do what it has normally done, which is use the current policy to the extent you can. But I also want to know, will they be able to fence what India plans to spend $3.7 million in fencing a border? We all know fences don't really keep people out, not the people you want to keep out. So will India be able to even do that along the border? Secondly, as Myanmar falls further, as the crisis increases inside Myanmar, what is the Indian government going to do? I believe what it will try to do is mitigate the impact in India's northeast to the extent it can, and hope that in a few years things will improve and the connectivity and all those projects will continue. And so I don't see any changes in that. Myanmar remains critical to India. Other countries can sanction Myanmar. They can ignore Myanmar. India cannot afford to do that. It learned the lesson when it, to some extent, ignored Myanmar in the 70s and 80s. It had problems in the Northeast. It wasn't able to work with the junta against many of the insurgent camps, whereas since the 1990s, they've actually worked together and collaborated in some instances when India has crossed the border and worked with the Myanmarese army against some insurgent groups. So that will continue. I agree with Avinash that regional connectivity will face challenges, but I think India still hopes that this will die down and that in some months or a year, they'll be able to move ahead in some fronts. I don't see India giving up on something which matters so much for India's connectivity and regional build-up in continental Southeast Asia.
Aparna, let me stay with you for a moment. Since you mentioned China a few times, to what degree is there concern in New Delhi over potential encirclement by China on its eastern flank? And of course, in the South and Indian Ocean region as well, but principally on the eastern flank. How concerning is this for New Delhi?
Extremely. And some of what Avinash mentioned earlier ties perfectly into this. So for India, India's immediate neighborhood, South Asia, but to some extent, Myanmar is an extended part of South Asia from India's point of view. Any immediate neighbor matters to India because all of India's neighbors are India's first layer of security. And India has resented any country, any external power having an influence in those countries. China has built that relationship of economic relations, but also of military relations, with whether it's India's neighbors on the east or India's neighbors on the west. And with Myanmar, the decades when India distanced itself, China really built a close relationship with Myanmar. So India's concern is one, with the bigger Chinese strategic encirclement, or what Indian analysts call string of pearls theory, attempt to basically tie India down to South Asia. It has concerns on the northern border with China and Pakistan, on the southern border with all the island nations where China is trying to come in, on the eastern border with Myanmar and China being there. Second is the way India has countered this is the last 3 decades tried to build closer relations. Avinash mentioned some of this: developmental assistance, the regional electricity grid, the trilateral highway, but also loans, lines of credit, even selling defense equipment, which India is normally hesitant to do. All of these to try to send a message to the junta that India's own democracy aside, India does not impose that on neighbors, and so it will ignore that way India's national interests, very realpolitik foreign policy. So at the end of the day, from India's point of view, what India would like in any of its neighbors, including Myanmar, is a stable country that keeps India's interests in mind. Now, it will not be able to wean Myanmar away totally from dependence on China, but as long as the junta believes that India is an option to balance against China, I think to some extent India's policy would succeed. The rising internal crisis inside Myanmar may result in the junta being unable to keep India's interest in mind. As Avinash earlier indicated, they may not be able to help India or allow India to do what India has been able to do all these years. But that's what India hopes, is that it can, in some ways, push back against China through these different efforts. For India, ports matter, infrastructure matters, because that is critical. And China building it vis-a-vis India or Japan or Australia or any of the other countries building it is a different message for India.
Yes, that's an interesting point. I'm glad you raised that, because in the popular discourse, China is often portrayed as a friend of the junta, but we mustn't forget that the Burmese regime, the Myanmar regime, has deep institutional historical suspicion of China because of ancient history, right? Not so ancient history, actually. Avinash, could you elaborate a bit on that? Your thoughts on all that, on the China aspect? How real and how justified is the concern in Delhi that China's influence is extending across its Near East?
Nirmal, I'll completely agree with Aparna on that. This is the key strategic challenge that India faces in its neighborhood, but also beyond, and definitely in its Near East. I'll give you a couple of examples, perhaps, to elaborate. After the Manipur conflict broke out last year, and when the National Investigative Agency got into action to crack down on a lot of armed groups that became active between the Imphal-Churachandpur belt in central Manipur and South Manipur, one of their charges in their most recent charge sheet is against the China module of the NSCNIM, which is a Naga separatist outfit, which operates still. It is in a ceasefire with the government of India since 1997. But the NIA charged that the China module of this outfit engaged with some of the more militant Manipuri groups in Myanmar. Now, the China module is a long-standing module. The individual is named Hangshi Tangkul. He has been based out of China for years and has operated in Myanmar across the border. And this has been a concern between India and China for a long time. Just like Paresh Barua, the chief of ULFA, the Assamese outfit, is still based out of China. So there's clearly that security angle too. Very real, very direct, very specific security concern being raised. That's one thing. The second thing is, again, Aparna mentioned this, all the projects that China has built as part of the China-Myanmar economic corridor. There were concerns in Delhi that a lot to secure these projects after 2021, there was possibly Chinese military presence, light presence on the ground across these projects, sensitive projects, right? The Chokpu special economic zone is very central to China's connectivity agenda with Myanmar. And there was a bit of extra presence of Chinese forces. Now, that does not mean they're involved in anything against India or Indian projects, but at least that raises concern for any state. And it also brings to mind a Chinese presence in Pakistan, the China-Pakistan economic corridor. So if you're sitting in New Delhi, you have a CMEC and a CPEC, and you have two neighbors who are fundamentally, structurally dependent on China. And if you increase the canvas in India's Near East and you bring in Bangladesh, the situation is actually more worrying than less. Now, I am very acutely aware that Bangladesh is arguably one of the few neighbors which still enjoys a deep political relationship with India. Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina is a great friend of historically the Congress party and the Gandhi family, but has worked closely with the BJP and Prime Minister Modi. And there's continuity on that front. But the moment you start digging deeper, things start to look a little bit more shaky. One, this is an individual who has centralized power considerably in Dhaka. So whenever there's a dislocation of power, it's likely to be undemocratic and likely to be turbulent. And whoever comes after, whenever that is likely to sit on a wave of deep-seated and wide-ranging anti-Indian sentiment across Bangladesh. And that sentiment has translated into domestic balancing strategies by Hasina, who has allowed the Bangladeshi army to be armed effectively by the Chinese. So just till a couple of years ago, CIPRI data, if I'm not wrong, shows that nearly 76% of the Bangladeshi army is equipped with Chinese equipment. China is building submarine bases in Bangladesh. It might not be basing its own vessels, but these are sensitive sectors. The Padma Bridge was financed by the Chinese and built by them. There are various other friendship bridges that have been built. The Dhaka Metro line was done by the Chinese. In the cyber sector, the cyber laws national security laws that Bangladesh brought into picture is Chinese technology. So again, you have an individual who's politically very open to you, but if that individual is not there, this is the Chinese story in the making. So yes, very, very, very serious concerns about Chinese ingress. And it feeds into this idea of encirclement, right? As Aparna mentioned earlier, that you are being encircled in various multiple ways. And one last point on this, Nirmal. Usually we are told that India's connectivity story has been a success with Bangladesh, even if it remains a challenge with Myanmar. And that's partly true. Then bilateral trade is somewhere between $16 to $16.5 billion, which is substantial. Now, of that, Bangladesh has a trade deficit of $14 billion. Now, this is a very deeply asymmetric connectivity. This is a connectivity which is helping India, but it's not really doing that much economic wonders for Bangladesh, which is at the cusp of a very acute economic crisis of its own for various different reasons. And that has actually created second-order negative effects for India among the Bangladeshi public that, fine, you're building rail, you're building road connectivity, you're allowing Nepal to export energy and electricity through grids. But what does that really mean? What does it mean when the Adani Group sends electricity from a power plant in Jharkhand at very high prices? It raises questions.
Right. Okay. Some of the things you say lead to a natural segue to India's domestic politics, which you, in fact, dissect in your book, especially in the last section, which is titled Termites. Now, for our listeners, that's the term used in 2019 by the powerful BJP, Bharatiya Janata Party, the ruling party politician Amit Shah, then and now India's Home Minister. He told a rally back then in the state of West Bengal that, quote, infiltrators are like termites in the soil of Bengal, and that the Bharatiya Janata Party will pick up infiltrators one by one and throw them into the Bay of Bengal. Of course, that was met with much consternation, as you can imagine. He was referring to illegal immigrants from neighboring Muslim-majority Bangladesh. Avinash, how important is domestic politics as a driver of foreign policy towards India's Near East? You mentioned some of it, but could you elaborate a bit?
Thank you for asking that question, Nirmal. I think it's very central. You cannot understand India's regional geopolitics without bringing in the domestic political lens. In fact, the little I learned from writing this book was that India's domestic state building, and that's a project that is going on till now, is deeply intertwined with India's regional diplomacy and statecraft. And I'll give you a couple of examples, right? The experience of mass displacement, communally charged mass displacement around partition, around 1949-50, around 1971, which led to war. That shaped India's national security interests around the fact that we don't want mass displacement of minorities from our neighborhood. It fuels politics in Assam and Bengal, and the movement of people, whether voluntary or otherwise, from East Pakistan, erstwhile East Pakistan, and contemporary Bangladesh. And that has fundamentally shaped India's approach towards which political partner or ally it prefers in Dhaka. The fact that Sheikh Hasina has responded historically to India's demand that Bangladesh should curb cross-border movement is something which is absolutely central to India's relationship with Bangladesh. Same with Myanmar. The fact that New Delhi and Naypyidaw, or even Yangon for that matter, have viewed their peripheries, which are primarily ethnic minority communities who more often than not practice Christianity, from a deeply communal lens as well, right? There's a very powerful narrative within, especially the Hindu right and the Burmese kind of Buddhist nationalist right wing in Myanmar, that it is the spread of Christianity that has led to secessionism, both in Myanmar's northwest and India's northeast. And these are trends which play out in different shapes and forms and are absolutely central. Now, as far as the BJP is concerned, and you referred to the chapter from my book, which is titled Termites, in quotes, of course, there have been two strands of BJP's approach towards the Northeast. The first strand, which was apparent till 2020-21, was to unite a very ethnically diverse, kind of religiously diverse region under the banner, under the rubric of a tolerant Hindu nationalism, a Hindu nationalism that celebrates that diversity and is not at odds, fundamental odds with Christianity, at least in that part of the country. And that we saw a shift against that in the run-up to the 2024 national elections. The fact that there was so much communal polarization, not just against Muslims, but also Christians, explains why BJP has effectively lost out after winning quite handsomely in 2019 elections, almost every state which has a Christian majority, and Manipur as well, which does not have a Christian majority, at least in Imphal. So you can see the domestic politics play out quite considerably. And the concern there is, at least at this point in time, India is seeking strategic unity in its Near East while fostering societal divisions. And that is a recipe, that's a contradiction that is tough to overcome in a longer term sense.
Okay, Aparna, how about a parting shot from you? And May I throw in a question which just occurred to me as well? Since you're sitting in DC, I know that everybody is obsessed with domestic politics in the US right now, but is there any concern or any depth of focus in the strategic community in DC on this issue of India's Northeast, Myanmar, the China aspect?
So your second question, a short answer would be unfortunately no. In DC, as both of you know, things normally become of interest when there's a crisis. And when there's a slow boiling crisis going on, people don't really focus on it unless something big happens. So unless barring something big, I don't see it happening. I agree with Avinash that the problems often, India's challenge is often with all of its neighbors, but then India's challenge is broadly with all of its neighbors. Ethno-linguistic borders are with all of its neighbors, whether it's Pakistan, Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh, Myanmar, Sri Lanka. All these neighbors, India is the big brother which is the hegemonic big brother which has taken over Sikkim and forcibly, if we go back in the past, which did help the creation of Bangladesh, but in some ways the breakup of Pakistan. And so it also shares ethno-linguistic relations. So Nepal has issues with Madhesis, Bangladesh has issues. And so it's difficult for India to balance something because all of these issues play out in Indian domestic politics, whether it's Bihar, it's UP, it's Punjab, it's Tamil Nadu, it's Bengal, it's all of India's Northeast. And so India has historically found it easier to deal with its neighbors, and it will find it easier to deal with its neighbors if it remains a little truer to its constitutional, secular, pluralist, democratic traditions. It will find it tougher to deal with its immediate neighbors if it changes that, because a status quo India, which is democratic, it's easier for the neighbors to deal with. An India which isn't revanchist, but it looks aggressive and demanding, will by default create long-term challenges for India, which India will find very difficult to deal with in the decades ahead.
Okay, good parting shot. Avinash, over to you for a last quick one.
No, thank you for saying that, Aparna. Constitutional survivalism, constitutional stability were the driving forces of India's domestic state building and regional geopolitics in the early years after independence. And there was a reason for that. That was a moment when India actually faced some of the most violent episodes, both within and outside in its immediate neighbors. This is a region which has been partitioned along communal ethnic lines to any ideology, anything that tries to undo these or play around with these fault lines. It's playing with fire. The Constitution is the blanket against that. And the only parting shot would be to say, whoever is listening, do not undervalue, do not underestimate the value of the Constitution of India. It's very important, not just in a domestic, but also in a regional sense.
Okay, excellent. Dr. Avinash Paliwal, Dr. Aparna Pandey, that was excellent as always, fascinating. Thank you, and stay well out there as we all follow these complex developments. And thank you for shedding light on them. It's very important in this age of chaos and uncertainty. That nicely wraps this discussion up for the Asian Insider podcast. I'm your host, Nirmal Ghosh. Join me and my expert guests for the next episode on the fourth Friday of every month.
Send your feedback to podcast@sph.com.sg. Find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or within our Straits Times app. Thanks for listening.